My name is Robert McKean, and 6 years ago I saw something that I couldn't explain then, and I can't explain even now. At the time I was a delivery driver, working in this remote location up in the northeast of Scotland. I won't bore you with the details, but the area was severely underpopulated. It was mostly small villages and a couple of maybe slightly larger towns, but in between miles of wilderness countryside. And I worked in one of the only Chinese takeaway restaurants, so I was their delivery driver, so I would constantly drive around all of these little places and deliver food. One night I was on one of these back roads, and it was pitch black. It always was. There was no lighting on those roads, and I very rarely encountered other cars at that time of night. I think it was about 11 at night or something like that. It was a sleepy area, so I was probably driving a little bit faster than I should have, because normally the roads were lonely and I like to get through them as quickly as possible. I remember driving along this country road, and the road arched round the side of a hill, and on the other side of it there was a large ditch. But on the sort of curve of this road I could see a car in the darkness. It had its hazard lights on. So I slowed down. I made sure my doors were locked, because you hear stories about people's cars being stolen and things like that, people being waved down and then someone jumps into the back seat of your car. And I have to say that just the sight of that car sitting there, for some reason I felt apprehensive about it. The headlights from my car, as I slowed down, illuminated a woman that was standing next to this parked car, and she was sheet white, and she was waving at me, and she seemed really distraught. So I pulled up alongside her and rolled my window down very slightly and asked her what the problem was, and she told me that she'd hit a deer, and she was really distraught about this. This is not, unfortunately, an uncommon thing to happen on the roads, especially not in these sorts of areas. Deer are constantly crossing across the roads up there, and in large parts of Scotland, to be honest. But she was really upset, and I could see that her windscreen was cracked and it had sort of shattered out in a place. So I knew she was telling the truth. And I could also see that there was like an impression on the bonnet of the car, as if the deer's body had smacked off it. So if it was a ruse to steal my car, I knew it was a pretty elaborate one. So I ended up getting out of the car, trying to reassure her. Her name was Diane, and she wasn't from the area. She was just driving through to a larger town up north. She didn't know the place at all, and she had no phone signal, so she couldn't call for like a rescue service or anything like that. So I looked at my phone as well, and there was no phone signal in that area. So I said, well, let me take a look at your car. And I went to get inside it, but she said no. She said, don't. She said, I'd rather you didn't. Didn't really think much of that at the time. I was like, fair enough, I'm a stranger. Maybe she thinks I'm going to drive off with her car or something like that. So I just said, right, okay, fine. And instead I tried to look at the front to see if, sometimes it's pretty grisly, but sometimes bits of these animals get caught in the front of a car or in the arch of the wheel, and that can cause problems for you driving, not being able to start your car, etc. But I couldn't see anything like that, but I could see some blood. And so she then became more concerned about the animal, which I thought was very kind of her, and she said that the animal, she'd heard it screaming, and almost as if, on call, as soon as she mentioned that, the animal started screaming, started crying out. Now, when you hear an animal crying like that when it's badly wounded, it's a terrible, terrible sound. And I've always loved animals, so I wanted to make sure that, how can I put this, that the animal's suffering wouldn't be longer than it needed to be. So I went to the back of my car. I got out a torch that I always keep in the car, and a shovel that I usually keep it in the boot of my car, because you get a lot of snow up in that area, and sometimes you need to sort of shovel yourself out in different places. So I said to her, I said, don't worry, just stay by the car. I'll go and check in the animal. And I said, and she's like, what are you going to do? And I'm like, look, if the animal's very badly wounded, it's not going to live, so I'm going to put it out of its misery. And she was horrified by this, but I told her, well, do you want the animal just to bleed out and have a long, protracted death? So, and then I said to her, look, I'll go and check on the animal, and then when I come back, I'll I can drive you to the next village, and you can call someone. She's like, no. She was absolutely adamant, and maybe she was scared of getting into my car, I don't know. She was absolutely adamant that she didn't want to go with me. So I said to her, well, okay, when I come back, I'll get in my car and I'll drive, and I'll phone a rescue service, or the AA or whatever, if she had a card for that. I'll go and phone them, and then they can come and see you. So I kept walking. I walked a few metres from the front of the car, and then I could see that there was a trail of blood down this ditch at the side of the road. And I remember the light from my torch catching something. And I remember saying out loud, it's not a deer. And so Diane shouted, what do you mean? But I couldn't answer it. I couldn't really take in what I was seeing. It looked like a man, but his face was away from me, and his hand, I always remember his hand was bent up behind his neck, and it was twitching, and his skin looked grey, and I'd seen that grey look before in people when they were gravely ill. And so I panicked. I panicked, and I realised that the man's legs were contorted. It was like his hips had been twisted in the impact. So I rushed back to my car and got a first aid kit that I had in the boot. I told Diane, I said, it's a man. I said, you've hit someone. But I have no idea who would have been walking along those lonely roads at that time of night. I ran back with the first aid kit, not knowing what I was going to do. I don't think I was thinking straight. What was a first aid kit going to do to someone whose legs were twisted round the wrong way? I think I just was in shock. But I was even more shocked when I got back to that ditch and I looked down. The man was gone. And where he'd lay, there was a pool of blood. But there was no sign of him. I thought he must have crawled off somewhere. And that was when I heard a horrid crack. It wasn't a dry crack, it was a moist crack. And I turned to see Diane screaming. There was a tall figure standing behind her, and all I can describe to you is that this figure, this man, had bitten into her skull, the top of her scalp, and was holding her tight, and her body was convulsing, and she was screaming. And I had the shovel, but well, I wish I'd done something with it. Maybe I could have helped her. But I was terrified. I've never seen anything like that. And I ran past them. I got into my car. And Diane was screaming. And then she stopped. And the man dropped her body to the ground. I managed to get into my car, but he wasn't interested in me. I remember those black eyes and the blood round his mouth. He was interested in something else. So I knew Diane was dead. I knew she was dead. There was nothing left for me to do. So I just drove away as fast as I could. But as the engine came on and I started moving, the man smashed the window into Diane's car. And I looked in horror as I saw two faces appear from underneath a blanket at the back. Two children. It was too late for them.